Alrighty.
Hey.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to our weekly deep dive podcast. My name is Nick Griffin. I am the lead pastor here at Wayfarers Christian Church. I'm here with my good buddy, Noah.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Noah's our teaching pastor here at the church. And here on these weekly podcasts, what we do is we just take an opportunity to try to dive a little bit deeper in the different topics that we have been covering in our Sunday services. We've got a really interesting one that we're kind of going into today. But for the last couple episodes, we've had some guests on the
Yeah, it's been great. We're getting some different voices in here.
It has been a lot of fun to have that variety. But today, it's just back to me and you, know. It's just the original crew,
the OG crew.
So I figured we got a little bit of time today. We could bring back a segment that we've kind of had to cut for time in the last couple times and just do. We've been calling them quirky queries, or just opportunities to ask some interesting questions to get us kind of thinking a little bit about each other, get to know each other, hopefully give you, all of you who are watching or listening, a chance to get to know us better too. And so I've got a question, kind of relates to what we're talking about today.
Okay.
I'm curious, when you were a kid, adults are always asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to? What job do you want to have? What would have been your answer to that question? And let's say I'm going to pick a specific age.
Yeah, I was about to say it changed so much and so frequently.
Let's say like 8 or 9.
8 or 9.
8 or 9 years old. What would you have said at that age? What did you want to be when you
I need to go back in time. 8 or 9 would have been. I was born in 1994, so that's 6. So this would have been 2003. Noah. Okay, there we go. So 2003, I would have still been at the Presbyterian church that I grew up in. So I probably around that time. Yeah. I had a lot of Legos, and I had a lot of different like building blocks and things that I could put together pretty well. And I've always done whatever anybody else told me I was good at. Anytime someone was like, "You're really good at this," I was like, "Oh, I could do that for the rest of my life." And so I was, you could basically make me be whatever I wanted, whatever I was going to be, as long as you told me I was good at it. And around that time, people were always saying that I was good at something. My mother would always say that I was good at computers, so that I should be a computer engineer. But at that time, several people had commented that I was like really good at like building things with my hands and things like that. So a lot of people were saying that I should be like a electrician or like a mechanic or something like that, that just worked with like
building
metals and building things and putting things together, which is really funny knowing me now. But yeah. So at that point in my life, my mother would buy me like a bunch of like toy sets that were all kind of building like things. There was like a magnetic set that was really cool where you could build like houses and skyscrapers and things just with magnets, little balls and magnet little pieces. And Legos were a big thing. We had both the Millennium Falcon and the Star Destroyer, complete Lego sets, and I built those completely from scratch. Well, I mean, I had instructions, but like
those are pretty big.
Yeah, those are pretty big.
Yeah.
Like those are 9. Like I think it's like 5,000 pieces in the Lego sets.
Yeah.
And I built all of it just on my own. So everybody was just always commenting on things like that. So that would probably been it at that point in my life.
Like a mechanic or a
probably
engineer,
more like an electrician. My dad was an electrician for a good part of his life, so that was influencing me. And so at that point, I was really into computers, and I really liked to see how they worked, and I really liked the idea of like building computers and any type of thing like that. At that age, I was really into that kind of concept. So probably that. What about you? I'm curious.
At that, like you said, it changed.
Yeah, at
over
that
the
age.
years, over the time.
Yeah, at 9.
But I remember at that age, I'm similar to you. Whatever people were like, "Oh wow, you're really good at that. You should do that." I was like, "Oh great, words of affirmation from other people. I'm gonna do exactly that because I need more of that in my life." But what I remember at the time was I was always like I've always been the nerd in
Mm.
school. I was always the nerdy smart kid who
Yeah.
did really well, got good grades, and I was a big fan of the TV show Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yeah. My mother wouldn't let me watch it.
Oh, really?
It was evolution, so
Yeah.
no.
I loved Bill Nye the Science Guy, and so what I always used to tell kids and other adults is like, I'm gonna be a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
I wanna be a scientist like Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yeah.
And I kind of had this just like, I've always had just kind of this overwhelming interest in like learning more about the world, understanding more how things work,
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff. It's funny because later on I realized I have that interest, but that's not necessarily science.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really good at science. Those were always, like an ACT and stuff like that. The science sections were my worst.
Okay.
Were my worst sections always. And in school, my biology, chemistry, those classes were always my worst subjects. So I think it was really just, like Nick's a smart kid. He likes getting good grades. He should be a scientist.
Yep.
But I do still have a lot of interests in that field myself. So it is kind of a interesting thing. But yeah, that's what I used to tell people.
It was funny for mine. I let that kind of die until my third or second year of Visible Music College, where I took a class on building guitar amps and building like soldering cables and things like that.
Yep.
And that was the first time that I'd ever looked at capacitors and all that kind of stuff again, and it was fun. There was so many days that I was remembering 9-year-old Noah really into that kind of stuff. So it was a fun little trip down memory lane. But we built a whole mini guitar amp from scratch, which was kind of cool. It was a group project, but yeah, it was fun.
Did anyone get to keep the guitar amp afterwards?
I think the professor did.
He had y'all do his work for him.
Yeah, it was one of those you buy a kit for building a guitar amp and then you just kind of build it. So there were several times it didn't work and we had to do different stuff. I didn't do a lot of that, honestly. It was mainly 3 people that really knew what they were doing, and I kind of was just watching. But
it
that's generally how group projects go.
It was at least enough to reignite the interest you had as a kid in tinkering with stuff and building stuff and all that.
That was one of the easiest classes I had at Visible.
Well, like I said, it sort of connects to what we're talking about, just because I think I was talking about this in a class. I get to teach a couple classes for Mid-South Christian College here, where we broadcast from. I think I've mentioned that. I may not have mentioned that on the podcast before.
Probably not on the podcast. You are a professor here at Mid-South.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, but I am. And I was talking about it with some of my students in one of our classes. We were talking about sort of the the way that as a kid some of your interests are kind of at their purest form, before you've lived life, before you've had experiences of other things that have pulled you in different directions. As a kid, you can sometimes most clearly see, these are the things I'm interested in, these are the things I want, these are the desires of my heart, I guess, to connect it to what we're talking about a little bit today. And I've talked to several people who say just when you kind of you'll just lose that sometimes. You'll lose what the things that you are the most interested in, or the things that were really deep, heartfelt desires of yourself. As you grow older, sometimes you might just become more cynical, and you just don't
What's
have that
that
sort
like?
of connection. Yeah.
We'll get into that.
And so it's helpful sometimes to go back to that time, and that's in general what we wanted to talk about a little bit is the desires of your heart. There's a famous Psalm 37, chapter 37, verse 4, which says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." It's a famous verse. A lot of people make it their life verse. They talk about they have it. written down in specific places, and it's an important verse for a lot of people, and we thought it would be helpful to unpack a little bit about what that verse means today on this episode. It sort of connects with what we were talking about Sunday. Sunday was Easter Sunday, so happy belated Easter to any of those of you that are tuning in now.
There's like a whole movement that wants to say like Happy Resurrection Day because like Easter is like a pagan holiday or something like that. I just found that out, so that's the only reason I'm bringing it up.
I have heard about that. That would have been a fun one we could have done on this episode.
I know.
Is Easter a pagan holiday or is it not? Because I used to be one of those people, and I have since changed my mind on that. I don't actually think there's actually way less data to back up that idea of like Easter being this reclaimed pagan holiday.
I'm really curious now, but we should continue on. But that's a good teaser.
We might talk about that at some other different point in time. But I wanted to take a different direction a little bit with the Easter Sunday sermon.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and so I wanted to just kind of keep going through it rather than to skip to like a different resurrection story or something like that. And it was really cool because it just happened to line up. The verse we were talking about was where Jesus talks about the importance of laying up for yourselves treasures in heaven instead of on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And the treasures on earth destroy. Instead, your reward and your treasure should be in heaven. And I think that that's like a really helpful thing that we kind of lose sight of sometimes in the Christian life, is that God is offering us a reward, a heavenly reward, an eternal reward for the actions that we may take. And what was cool is that the way that lined up is that part of the awesome promise of Easter, the resurrection and what we celebrate on Easter Sunday, is that that's kind of our first taste or our first glimpse at that reward. We get the reward is just kind of abstract when Jesus is talking about it, and it becomes this really concrete thing that we can see exactly what that reward looks like on Resurrection Sunday, on Easter Sunday. You get to really see kind of a taste of what is promised to us. And that's what the Apostle Paul and other writers in the New Testament key in on later on as they talk about, like our hope is in the resurrection. That's why it's such a big deal to Paul when people start trying to say the resurrection didn't really happen or it's not something. He's like, if the resurrection didn't happen, then not only is that a huge bummer for, everything that we're saying, but that's actually personally a huge bummer for you because the promise you have is this heavenly promise, this promise of resurrection. And if it didn't happen with Jesus, then it's not going to happen with you either. So it was huge. It was super important for Paul that we pay attention to the resurrection and understand that that's kind of just a taste of the reward and the promise that we have in heaven. And so the reason I think it kind of connects with that verse that we're talking about in Psalms is that part of the difficulty we have sometimes when we talk about heavenly promises or heavenly rewards is that they are rewards that we will only get later on. We don't have any promise of a reward here and now. It's only a promise of a reward in heaven. And I've heard some people apply that verse in Psalms that way, and they'll say the delight yourself in the Lord, he'll give you the desires of your heart, the things that you really desire.
Right.
But you're not going to get them until heaven. That's when you will kind of get the desires of your heart. And I kind of flip-flopped all over the place on whether I think that's a good application of that verse. But it's something that personally me and you, Noah, have been talking about for a little over a week now. We've been talking about some of the issues related to this.
Yep.
And I will say ahead of time, this is going to be one of those episodes where I don't think either of us have it figured out right now. So we're just kind of riffing. We're just talking through things. Would love to see any comments you guys have for those of you watching, anything else that anybody else is thinking about as it relates to this topic. But I think what I wanted to ask you, Noah, is that's kind of been the perspective you've had a lot of times, right? That part of the promise of this psalm, that God's going to give you the things you want. He's going to give you the desires of your heart. It's never really going to fully be fulfilled until the afterlife.
And I would say for this psalm in particular, I've always kind of seen it in the same light as like Proverbs, where Proverbs says a lot of things about how good things will happen to you if you follow the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But, I had one pastor one time explain the Proverbs as they're more like guidelines as opposed to like promises.
Mm-hmm.
A proverb is not a promise. A proverb is a general rule of thumb
Mm-hmm.
that most of the time works. And it's not promising that this will always be the case, essentially. And that's what a pastor taught me growing up. And I actually think that's a good point. Your dad actually just said that like 5 minutes before we went on air.
Yeah, he was chilling in here talking to us, and we were debriefing before we went live, and that was kind of one of his points.
Yeah. So I think that's where Psalm 37 would have fallen in the camp on. But if you were to ask me, say I did see it as a promise, I probably would say yes, it's a promise for the afterlife. Like it's not, you won't get the desires of your heart your entire life that you're living here and now. You will get those desires in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think you have landed in that place? What is your...
There's a long story to that.
Sure.
But
we got time?
Yeah. I'll try and give the shorter version so we can actually talk about it a little bit more. But in many ways, I find it really, my own life as a Christian, I wouldn't say that I've had most of the desires of my heart met that I started out with. And I was talking to your dad about this. There is a huge theme in Scripture of dying to yourself, right? And this idea of you having to actually surrender the things that you desire, even, so that God then can put new desires in your heart. And that was what your dad and I were talking about before we went on air. And I really kind of jive with that because many of the desires that I had as a punk teenager, I would call either unrealistic, unattainable, especially as someone that has read so many fantasy books that train you to dream big, and that's kind of Disney's message is like the sky's the limit on what you can dream.
Yeah,
and
anything's possible.
Anything's possible as long as you believe, and you have the grit and grind to like push into that, and I'll give a caveat here. It might just be that like I didn't have the grit and grind, and it could be that Disney's right and that all you need is confidence and self-assurance and the willingness to, if you put your mind to anything, you can achieve anything. But I just don't think, at least in my life, that that's been the case. I feel like I have a pretty solid worth ethic when I want to, and when I want to is the important key word phrase there. But I just don't feel like I've put in a lot of effort in some things, hoping for things to happen. I'm trying to be vague here because if we go into specifics, it'll just take all day. But
overall, you're saying there were a lot of things you wanted, a lot of things you desired pretty wholeheartedly. Like, that have not
been met.
Right.
Yeah.
And so your options at that point either are God doesn't give you what you want, or he'll give it to you later.
Right. Or maybe this is just a desire I need to die to, which has kind of been most of the desires in my life. I've just sort of, many of them I will say, and I've mentioned this before, but I'm an Enneagram 4. Enneagram 4s I've found are like the kings of desiring, kings and queens of desiring. Like, our sin is envy, which is twisted desire, if you've ever thought about that, right? Envy is a desire to be like someone else next to you, or to have the life that someone else has next to you, right? And so overall, if there's someone that has to deal with bad desires of any of the 9 Enneagram types, it's the Enneagram 4s, just because that's our sin. That's our core fault. So I think for me, I had to learn that so much of my desires were actually envies, not actually desires, you
Yeah.
know? And because of that, I had to kill them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I had to get rid of them. And that's not fun, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just part of the journey. And I'm glad you said that we don't have this answer figured out, because at the point in my life I'm at now, I've done a lot of the work of killing a lot of the things I would have called envies. And nothing's sort of come to replace that yet.
Right.
You know, I'm kind of in this weird spot in life where I have very few envies or desires anymore. You know, like I have a couple that I keep, but for the most part, like I've graduated college, so my desire to like get a degree is done. You know, I've now like in a pretty stable job, so like my desire to be like stable is kind of met. And so there's only a couple left that like I have left that are even on my radar, and of those few, they're very material. You know, they're not very like external, I guess. And the ones that are like really big, I guess, that are huge desires, I've kind of already have died to, in a sense, because I feel like they're so big and so asking so much of the world in general, that it's really hard to desire those now, because they're just so like in my mind impossible to meet without just some dramatic things happening, you know? So yeah, that's kind of the short answer of where I'm at in it all, is that, and I will give a couple examples of one of those, is that I'm really big on reconciliation. I hate it when people fight. I hate conflict. And there is just a lot of conflict in our world right now. There's a lot of, disagreements on both sides. And one of the biggest desires I've ever always had going through life recently has been that like people just get along, you know, and like it's really hard to go through your life having that desire because people don't get along. And yeah, and so that's just one example of something that I'm really like wanting, that I don't know if it's possible to have happen in our lifetime.
Right.
You know?
And I think that's always been one of the interesting things as we've had this conversation about some of these topics. You have had a different experience in your life than I have, I think. I always try to acknowledge it, but I don't, and I don't want to deny it, but I definitely have increasingly come to terms with the fact that I've had a very, very good life with a lot of the things I've ever wanted getting accomplished, and different things like that. And so usually, the modern term a lot of people talk about is, you've just had a lot of privilege, whether because of your wealth or your race or whatever else. I've just had the privilege of getting a lot of things, a lot of my desires satisfied. Even like a big one a lot of people talk about is, a lot of people really want to be married. And I know I was the first of all my friends that got married, so like, I've always been pretty blessed in that way. And so that's kind of the interesting thing about having the two different perspectives, is you'll have the perspective of someone like me who's like, yeah, trust in God, delight in Him. He'll give you what you want, because
it happened to you.
What I want.
Yeah, it happened to you.
But I have had that conversation over and over again with you and with other friends of mine, and just realizing that that's not as much the norm. There are a lot of people who really, really want things really, really deeply, and they haven't gotten them, and they don't get them. And like you pointed out, that is a dilemma. That's a problem. You'll read verses like this one and others that talk about ask, seek, knock, and you will receive. That talk about God's a good father who's going to give you good gifts. And, those verses can be difficult if there's something you really, really want
Mm-hmm.
and you haven't received it.
Right.
You know, and like you said, there's different ways to sort of resolve that tension, but that's kind of what we wanted to take a chance to talk through a little bit today. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the ones we've touched on it briefly. One of the ways a lot of people resolve that tension is like, well, the world is fallen, the world is broken,
Mm-hmm.
and you just won't get that fulfillment
Until
afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And we both talked about, I was always really uncomfortable with that because it kind of made it sound like Christianity had nothing to offer you here and now.
Mm-hmm.
The only offer was in the afterlife. And I tried to fight against that, but you've helped me realize it, and I've realized it myself as I read through the Bible. That is a pretty big thread that runs through a lot of the Bible. Paul even kind of assumes it in a very famous passage in Corinthians where he talks about if there is no resurrection, then
we are the most to be pitied.
We're the most to be pitied. And it's interesting. He actually says in that, if not, we should just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It's just this very
it's a very nihilistic. Mm-hmm. He is very much convinced that the only thing that gives you hope is the resurrection.
Absolutely. And so I have had to become more open to that. That is a part of what Christianity is offering us, because to live the Christian life means to live in a way that's counter to the way other people live, and it's going to cause you some hardships, and some pushing back of the things that you want and the things that you want to receive. But so I want to be a little bit more open to that, but I don't think that that's fully what is meant by that verse or the Proverbs or even some of the words of Jesus. I do think, if we're being honest about reading those verses and the words of Jesus, I don't think that the people listening to him then would have been like, oh, okay, he's talking about heaven, because the interesting thing is that kind of the idea that we have of heaven and of the afterlife wasn't actually as common in Judaism as a lot of people might believe. They were very nebulous about the afterlife, and there were a lot of Jews that weren't even sure there was an afterlife. So I don't think they would have fully understood Jesus' words in that way, and I don't think we should either. And so the second way people kind of resolve that tension a little bit, you also kind of mentioned, is like, well, maybe I just want the wrong things, and I think there is a section of truth to that. Obviously, we've all really, really, really wanted something, and then later on been like, man, I am glad I did not get that. I had a whole idea of all these tattoos that I wanted to get whenever I was like 19, 20. I was like, man, I had this like full sleeve planned out of like these tattoos I really wanted to get. And boy, am I happy that I did not get any of those tattoos back then. I wanted them so bad, but they were all things that I was into at the time that I'm not as into now, and would have been way less meaningful. And some of them a little cringy, I think, in so late 20s version of myself looks back on there. So that's definitely a part of it. Yeah, you don't. We have to recognize that sometimes we want things that, in the long run, we don't actually want.
And I'll to that point, I will say, when it comes to desires, they come from your imagination generally. Like you're imagining. Let me break this down. So when you have a desire, it's because you've seen something, maybe on television, in real life, whatever it is. You've seen a very idealistic depiction of that thing that happens, So you probably saw some rock drummers and guitarists that had that whole tattoo sleeve kind of thing, and you're like, that looks cool, And so then what you see then goes into your imagination, and you're then thinking about and imagining what that would look like on your arm, right? And then you're like, designing and all this stuff. And as you begin to do that, I think that the cool factor begins to kind of take off in your brain, you know? Like, I just think that because it's not attached to anything, it just sort of like skyrockets, you know? And so then it might convince you to do it. And then, 5 years later, you're like, oh, that's not as cool as it was in my head, you know? And that's the danger of imagination that I don't think a lot of people talk about, is that imagination is great. It can transport you into ways it can escape you, but there is no limit to how dreamy and how cool everything is.
Your imagination doesn't have to be realistic.
It doesn't have to be realistic, exactly. And so a lot of times, and I know this as like an artist and creator, is like a lot of times what you idealize when it's actually brought into the physical realm,
when it becomes
when it's
real.
taken from your head into real life and you put it on paper, you have to reconcile the fact that like what you're doing in real life might not match up to what's up here, you know? And I see this all the time with like hipsters, like any type of person that's really into craft. One of the number one things I've noticed is that they are very dissatisfied with everything they do because they have a version of their craft in their head, an imagination in their head. They have a desire for this cup of coffee, for instance, to be the best cup of coffee. And they will go through 20 different steps to make it the best cup of coffee. But then when they drink it, it's all right. You know, like, because it will never achieve the infinite status of amazingness and awesomeness that is in your head, because your head has no limit.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does. And that's really good distinction. That's important to realize. And so that's definitely a part of it. Sometimes we got to realize we may be wanting things that we think we want in the meantime, but in the long run we don't actually want. And we have to believe that God actually knows what we're going to want long term, and he's not just going to give us these little small desires if he knows deep down you don't really want that tattoo sleeve. Let's not make that happen. And that's helpful too, to think about that aspect of it. But I think one of my frustrations as I've thought through that is that I personally, I don't know, you can push back if you don't believe this, but I personally believe every single want, every single desire, every single thing that's out there that we want, even if it's not fully going to satisfy, or even if it's not fully what we actually will want in the long run, or even if it were going to change what we want in a little bit, I still think there is like a deeper kernel of like true heartfelt human desire in everything that we want. So what I mean by that is like everything that you've ever wanted really badly, that you've had that like feeling of desiring it, of wanting it, something that your heart's really desired. I think that God made us a certain way. He made us to want certain things. And there's a real deep part of the way God made us in every desire. And I personally believe that those are going to be satisfied someday. It's not just this like longing that you're never going to actually get to accomplish.
Yeah. And part of me wants to agree with you on that. I think that there's some truth to that. But what I was thinking about recently was the character of Puddleglum, actually, in the Silver Chair. And
one of the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes, sorry. I didn't realize that people might not know what that is. If you don't, shame on you. But written by C.S. Lewis, and that's really who we're mainly talking about today, because all your sermon was based on a quote by him and things like that. But Puddleglum is a character in the Silver Chair who is an eternal pessimist. Absolute, just every situation he expects the worst thing to happen. But what's interesting is he's not a gloomy pessimist. He's actually an optimistic pessimist, which means that he sees all of life as always going to be the worst thing possible, but then says, I must put the best face on it. Like, I must look at it and say that the best thing will happen even if I expect the worst to happen, right? And so he'll say like really quirky lines, like they're traveling down a ravine that has a river at the bottom of it, and it's a really steep ravine, and he says the bright side of it is if we break our necks getting down the ravine, we're safe from being drowned in the river. And just, you know, really like makes you think of like, you know, it's better than drowning, you know. So why I bring him up is I feel like one of the things that happens in the silver chair at the end of the book is a moment where everybody is really doubting whether or not the world that they've experienced was actually real.
Yeah.
And it takes too long to explain, but just take me for my word is that there's this whole ending scene where they're like basically being enchanted to believe that where they are located is the only world, and where they've traveled their entire portion of the book doesn't exist at all, and it's not real. And Puddleglum is the character that breaks the enchantment that they're all under by saying that even if it's true that the only world that exists is this world that we're living in now, which is a dark world and scary and bad and awful, even if that's true, then the imaginary world that we think exists, the world they've been traveling in this whole time, seems a lot better than what we're living in right now. And I'm going to stand by my imaginary world instead of this world, you know? Like, I'm going to act as if things that were in the imaginary world are real, because that is better than just existing in this dark place, right? And so that's where I've come to in my beliefs of this and with my own desires, is that all of the desires that I want to be fulfilled and all of these imaginary like are all in my head. I have like videotapes in my head playing of how those desires could be fulfilled, right? You know, I can play the movie reel in my head. That might be those stories may never happen, right? But I take Puddleglum's stance on it these days of the fact that, yeah, it's probably not real, but if that's the case, then I'm still going to stand by it. You know, like it's the statement of this is not real, but I'm still going to live by the play world. You know, I'm going to live by my imaginary world. And that's kind of the things we've been talking about. I see the same thing in Tolkien where at the last battle at Pelennor Fields, the Rohirrim are mustering all of their strength, and they realize that the orcs are like way more than they ever possibly could deal with, and they only have 6,000 spears, and Mordor's orcs have like millions, and they're like, we won't even break the lines with this number. And Theoden says, no, we can't, but we'll meet them in battle nonetheless. You know, and it's the statement of, yes, this is reality, but we're still going to do it, you know? And that's just been my way of getting through it. I know that you've had a different way of looking at that, because you really do want to feel like the actual way that life pans out is way better than those odds. But yeah, like that's where I've come to on it.
Yeah. It's kind of, you know, obviously C.S. Lewis, when he's writing, and Tolkien even to some extent, they are using their literature and their fiction to like symbolically talk about
those issues,
the issues that we're talking about today. And it's clear that in that example you gave of Puddleglum from Narnia, that a big part of what it seems like Lewis is implying there is kind of this idea of like, a lot of people will kind of talk down to Christians and act like Christians are weak-minded.
Yeah.
They're little kids who can't accept that the world just sucks.
Yeah.
And they can't accept it, so they make up this imaginary world. whereas I'm an adult. I look at how the world really is. I'm a realist, they'll say. And I recognize that it sucks, and I can face it head on, whereas you guys are, too weak to face it. So you make up this idea of heaven and all these promises that are going to be fulfilled. And Puddleglum's answer is an answer that Christians could give too, is just like, even if that's the case, it's just the reality of all of this is just so awful. What do you gain by being the realist and acknowledging how messed up everything is? I always think a lot of the philosophical movement of nihilism, which is a philosophical movement that assumes basically that. There's no meaning to anything. There's only the meaning you create. Everything's actually pointless. It's all meaningless. It's whatever.
Yeah.
And a lot of the most famous nihilist philosophers are the ones who levy a lot of those arguments against Christians, saying that we're just weak and we're just, wishful thinking is a big part of Christianity. And I've always been really impacted by the fact that I think this is true, but I think every single major nihilist philosopher that I'm familiar with kills themself at some point before the end of their life. They all die by suicide at some point or another. And that's kind of Lewis's point, I think, vicariously in that is like, what do you really gain by being this like pessimistic realist who's just like, the world is awful, there's no hope, and I'm just accepting it?
Yeah.
He would argue you don't actually gain anything because you humans can't live that way, And that's where I am. You the second example you give from Lord of the Rings, I know it's been important to you because you brought it up a few different times, different conversations we've had. But what I'm skeptical of, if we're taking that example and transferring it all the way to today, is that I don't know that anybody does that without some sort of hope. Nobody says, well, we're outnumbered, but we're going to do it anyways, without something greater motivating them. So it could be either a hope that you never know, something could work out. It could just be as simple as a deep-held desire for honor and bravery and the importance of character, and just knowing that to run away would be to go against their character. And it was kind of my point I made in the sermon. I really think humans always do things. We have some reason we're doing everything. We're never just like selfless and doing it for no self-fulfilling reason. Yeah. And I'm more and more increasingly comfortable with the fact that God understands that because he made us that way. He made us to long after and desire after certain things. And because I have a particular belief in the character of God, I don't know that he would place those desires in our hearts if he did not intend on them actually being fulfilled. And that's actually a point Lewis makes later on. You can start by saying, what do you actually gain by being this like pessimistic realist? You're just going to kill yourself in the end because you lose all hope. So I would rather be the imagination optimist who lives in the clouds. Right. It's just better. It's a better option if I'm weighing the two. But the secondary point that Lewis has made several times is the question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we desire these things if they don't actually exist? There's a pretty famous quote. You might can clarify it. I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's something like, if there it is, it's a Lewis quote, but it's something like, if there's a desire that nothing in this world satisfies,
we were made for another world.
Yeah. Then it probably means we were made for another world. And so,
because he compares that to like, okay, we have a desire for food, for eating, so there must be something like food to satisfy the desire for nourishment, right?
It would be super weird if we lived in a world where everybody was hungry,
but
food never existed.
But food never existed. Yeah.
And so because of that, I do believe that the things we want, some level of them, I think they're mixed up. They're, humans are complicated, and we have a mixture of good and bad desires. But in every single desire, I think there is something good. There's a part of it that is like the true desire that God is eventually going to fulfill.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the solution is to try to like numb ourselves to those feelings and those longings. I actually think that can be harmful to us. The example I've always used is of Abraham, because Abraham is one that gets brought up a lot when people are saying, you just need to quit wanting any of this stuff, just cut it off, quit desiring these things. And they'll use Abraham as an example, talking about how God asks Abraham to kill Isaac, sacrifice Isaac. And all Abraham's wanted his whole life
is to have a
kid.
Yeah.
He finally gets it. He finally gets his desire fulfilled in Isaac. And then God says, okay, now go and sacrifice
Isaac.
Yeah. And so a lot of people think that what God is doing in that moment is he is forcing Abraham to kill that desire, to die to himself, so that he can serve God better. And a lot of people have this attitude, this idea that that's what I need to do. So if I want to be married, that's a simple one I know a lot of people will use. I really want to be married. That's a deep-held desire a lot of people have. And I know a lot of Christians that will look at the story of Abraham and they will say, the example I can get from Abraham is that I'm never going to be able to actually be married. I'm never, because we know the end of the story. He doesn't have to go through with the sacrifice. He gets Isaac. And so they say, the only way I'm ever going to get married, the only way God's ever going to give me that, is I have to do the Abraham thing, and I have to take that knife, and I have to kill this desire. So I'm never going to be able to be married until I give up hope of ever being married. Until I give up on marriage, I'm never actually going to get to be married. And they use the example of Abraham as a defense of that. My difficulty with that is that there's a book in the New Testament, book of Hebrews. We don't really know who wrote it. It's one of those interesting anonymous books in the Bible. But the writer of Hebrews mentions Abraham along with several other people, that he's like, these are people whose faith you should really emulate, look up to. And a lot of people call it the Faith Hall of Fame, this famous section at the end of Hebrews where it's listing all these people whose faith we should emulate, and he mentions Abraham. But one of the things that was so interesting to me is that the writer of Hebrews mentions that Abraham goes through with the sacrificing of Isaac, the binding of Isaac. The reason Abraham goes through with it is because he believes that God is the God who can resurrect the dead. And so what that has proved to me is that Abraham never fully gave up on the desire, because there was still a part of him that had hope, had an understanding in God. God's the God, kind of God who can resurrect the dead. And so I just don't believe Abraham ever fully killed the desire.
Fully killed it.
And if that's the example we're using all the way through, then I don't know that we should either. I don't know that we should ever fully give up hope. Sometimes what we need to understand is that the fulfillment may not come the way we think it will. So Abraham thought he was getting Isaac, and that was it, and that was how the promise was going to be fulfilled. And then God asks him to do this thing, and so then he's like, that's weird, I'm not expecting that. But he still didn't give up hope. And I think the writer of Hebrews makes that clear. He still was like, okay, I'm going to have to go through with this. But God's the kind of God who can resurrect. And I'm just going to keep hoping that that's what he's going to do. He's just doing this weird thing where I have to kill Isaac, and then he'll resurrect him, and I'll come back.
I think there is a bit of... it might also relate to how much of a stumbling block it is for you. Because I do think Jesus goes so far as to say that, if your right eye causes you to sin, cut it off, right? Right eye, sorry, right hand. You can't cut off your eye. But
gouge it out.
Gouge it out. Which seems to imply that at some level, he is asking his followers to kill things that are stumbling blocks to following him. You know, like that seems to be the message there is you may need to destroy things that prove stumbling blocks to following after me.
I don't know, because I don't know that that's what Jesus is talking about in that passage.
Yeah.
Jesus is talking about things like about us that may cause us to sin. And it's better, he says, to go into the afterlife without one hand than for your whole body to go into hell. So sometimes there's going to be really, really hard decisions that you have to
see. But
I don't know that he's talking about desire there.
Yeah, I guess when I read that verse, I'm using desire here instead of a hand. But it's like, oh, it's better that my desire to be married, let's take that example, is thrown into hell than for me, my whole self, to be thrown into hell because of that, you know, or something like that. That's kind of how I'm reading it. And I could be wrong there, but I'm just saying that, you know, if my desire to be married overtakes, you know, and I've known people that have done this. I've known people that have broken up with really awesome people and partners because they felt like they were they were loving them more than they were loving God even. And so they've just like cut all ties, you know?
Right. And that's where
you would disagree with that.
Yeah, because I've seen that really bad. You know, I've seen that be a really bad thing. Yeah. And I'm just more and more skeptical that that's actually what God is asking us to do.
Yeah.
He obviously says that we need to die to ourselves. That's clear, you know. But Lewis's point in The Weight of Glory, which is the sermon I pulled a lot of stuff from for Sunday's message, which, by the way, if you guys have not read it, it's not a super easy read, but I really recommend it. It's really good. Go read. It's free online. Just look up PDF for the sermon, The Weight of Glory. It's a sermon good that Lewis gave on this same exact topic. But one of the points he makes in it is that death to self is not the end. It's a step in the middle to get to the end. And Jesus Jesus even assumes that, because he says, if you want to gain your life, that's the end goal. The end goal is gaining your life. Then in the middle, you die to yourself. And Lewis's problem is that we as Christians have become convinced that that's the end goal, is the die to yourself part.
Right.
Without the hope at the end of gaining something.
And so I guess what I'm saying more so is like, sorry, but I guess what I'm saying is like, it does seem as if he's very much stating that in this life you need to be willing to give up everything, and I think that includes desires. A good example of this would be a parable you've brought up before, where a man finds a pearl of great value, and it's like the most important find he's ever thought. And so what does he do? He sells everything he has. And I read that as like all desires that he's had up until that point out the window. My one singular desire now is to own this pearl, you know, and purchases the land so that he gets that pearl. And he says the kingdom of heaven is like that, you know. And, you know, I don't know, like I it's possible that like God could bring back all of the things he sold, you know, like it's possible that like, you know, he sold the things and then like someone else gives them back, but I don't know if we're guaranteed that, you know. Does it make sense?
No, and that's not what I'm saying. I actually think that the similarity there is that they are both treasures in the parable.
Yeah.
They're both treasures of value, you know. And his point is that he sells the temporary treasures or all the other treasures he has to gain the more valuable treasure.
Right.
And so
Because I think people that break up with their girlfriend or boyfriend for the sake of God think they're doing that. I think they're selling. I think they think they're selling all of their possessions, and just like following the pearl, right?
Yep.
And
I think what I'm realizing
mm-hmm.
is that the promise of the kingdom of heaven
Mm-hmm.
is God,
Mm-hmm.
and also the desires of your heart being fulfilled.
Mm.
So, one, I'm just skeptical that people ever actually do kill off everything.
Oh,
I don't actually think
I'm
that's
actually
possible.
as skeptical as you are on that point.
And my point is, Abraham is, I think, a biblical example of that.
Yeah.
It's not like he ever actually gives up hope. So I'm just tired of continuing to call people to that, because I don't know that that's possible, and I'm not sure that's what God's asking us to. I don't know that God is telling you to fully kill your desire. I think there's always a bit of hope that it is okay for you to hold on to that hope.
You haven't seen the movie Whiplash, have you?
No.
Okay. It's a great movie, and it's all about this, by the way. It's about a drummer.
Yeah, jazz drummer.
Yeah, jazz drummer that literally sacrifices every other desire but drumming. And like the whole point of the movie is like you will only be the best drummer possible if you give up your girlfriend, give up your like living situation, like never sleep. Like it basically goes through all of the sacrifices that he has to make to be the best drummer ever. And it's an interesting like journey that he goes through, because at the end you as the viewer are not sure that it was worth it, because he had to give up so much. But the message there is that if you really want something, the things you love are the things that keep you the most from being able to attain that, and that's actually a big theme in Till We Have Faces, is that the biggest temptations are the things we love the most, the things we desire the most. I'm not saying I disagree with you. I'm just trying to give the other side, It's that like, I do feel like there is a huge danger in earthly desires, and that they can oftentimes be these things that prevent us from following God correctly. And I think you're right. I don't think you can fully call someone to like just never like participate in earthly desires. But I don't know. And this is why both you and I have not come to a full conclusion on the matter yet, is that it's very complicated. It's complicated to think about, where does the desires of my heart for earthly things stop, and where does the desires of my heart for heavenly things begin, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, because I think I'm just fully convinced that, or not fully, but I'm pretty convinced that there is a eternal component to every earthly desire.
Yeah.
So it's not like they are opposites or something like that. It's not like heaven and earth are opposite things. So a heavenly desire is the opposite of the earthly desire. They're similar, And Jesus's point is that you will settle for the earthly desire when you have a better option.
Right.
So it's not the opposite option or a completely different option. It's a better version of the same thing.
Right.
Is my point. And I think that's the point even in the treasure thing. It's not like it's a completely different thing. It's just a better version of the other thing. And so it's a matter of degree, I think, lots of times.
Yeah.
And that's my issue with the attitude sometimes people have of fully killing off certain things. Because I think those things are meant to point you to heaven. So here and now, I really, really desire to not be hungry, like food's a good one.
Mhm.
You know, it's a simple one. We
Right.
desire to eat. Jesus takes that desire for food and he talks about he uses it to bring people to him. He actually says, "Come to me, all you who hunger and thirst," you know?
Yeah.
And he uses the desire for drinking water with the woman at the well,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And he just offers her living water where you'll never thirst again.
Mm-hmm.
The desires, I think, are the avenue that Jesus pulls on those heartstrings, on those things that we desire, to draw people to him and to draw people to the promise of heaven and the kingdom of God and everything else like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry sometimes that we are actually killing the thing that points us to God in a desire to try to serve God. And I don't really worry about it because, again, I don't actually think anybody does it.
Yeah.
I think they just convince themselves they do it.
Yeah.
And it does take some wisdom, and maybe that's kind of the thing we can kind of end with today, is that it takes some wisdom to figure out which components of the things that I want are the sort of heavenly eternal components that point me to God, which ones are the ones that are getting in the way.
Yeah.
And that could be sort of the thing that we ask God to help us discern a little bit, is
which is which. Yeah.
Which is which. Because I do think we have to put to death certain things.
Oh, for sure.
But I'm just saying you can't ever fully put it to death, the whole of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that we should. I think we just are supposed to parse out which parts of it are the parts that are the lesser versions of the thing.
Yeah, and I will say, yeah, I think the word numb is better than kill, because generally people will numb their desires more so than they'll kill their desires, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're right on that. I do think that, I don't know, this might have been all over the place, this episode, but I do feel like the thing that I really have, I guess I don't want people to walk away feeling like disappointed that they're like, you know, desires haven't come to fruition, you know? And sometimes, I don't know if you felt this way, but sometimes when I heard like someone say, oh, but they'll be met in heaven, you know, that was always kind of a bit of a letdown. It's like, oh, you know, 70 years and I'm never going to have this desire met or whatever. And I guess what I'm saying is that I do feel like it's the numbing is sometimes a way of coping, you know, more so than it is a way of just like just being negative towards them, you know. You can still love those desires, but also try and maybe numbing's the wrong word. Maybe putting them on the back burner is a better phrase to use for them. Just kind of letting them chill out for a little bit. And because I do think you can prioritize your desires. I think you can mentally decide like what you're focusing on right now, and you can really work on. So if you have desires in your life that you feel like are not being met right now, but maybe have one that seems a little bit more achievable than these other 5, you know, then maybe you can focus on that desire and work towards that while these other 5 hang out on the back burner, if that makes any sense. So I don't know. Maybe that helps in terms of how to navigate it in our life today. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, like I said at the beginning, we've this is something we've been having this conversation for a few days now at this point.
Yeah.
Because there is a difference. It's a difficult subject to kind of parse out. I mentioned a little bit that's part of the. There's a lot of talk of this idea of the prosperity gospel, which is this type of Christianity that says that whatever you want, God's going to give it to you.
Yeah.
And if you give enough money, He'll give you 10 times that back. Everything that you want, God's going to give it to you. And I do think that we are from more conservative church backgrounds that are super not down with the prosperity gospel. You know, we don't want anything to do with that. And maybe in sometimes our desire to avoid the prosperity gospel, I worry that we have painted God in a way that I don't think is accurate to his character.
Yeah.
And so we don't have it all figured out, but I am very convinced that God is good and God wants what's best for us. And so that is something that we can kind of keep our focus on and see as we go and we figure out what all of this means the more and more we think about it. So we're just going to leave it at that for today. Yeah. I'm wondering if this might be helpful to carry over to next week a little bit too, and some other things like that we can keep talking about. We might bring on another special guest next week. We'll see how it goes. But either way, for those of you that have been tuning in, kept up with this conversation. Hopefully you've been able to keep up. It may have been a little meandering. We hope it maybe is helpful to you, gave you some things to think about. We're very thankful for all of you who have been tuning in and watching with us. We hope to see you next week for the following deep dive. And if you're available this Sunday, we would love to see you for our Sunday evening church live stream. So those are at 7 o'clock on Facebook. Just look for the Wayfarers page, whether you're watching it live here with us or if you're listening to the podcast, look for Wayfarers CC on Facebook. We would love for you to join us and just continue to tune in as we go through all of these difficult topics and, just try to be honest about what it is like to live the Christian life. And we're just thankful that you guys are along for the ride with us. So we will see y'all either this Sunday or next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, all.